Hi, folks. I have belatedly and somewhat hastily decided that I should perhaps add a little effort to give you a model of how we might apply Lefebvre's framework to an existing city. And in our case, it seems like Seoul is the appropriate one to do since you've seen some pictures of its history um, and since it's a city that you cannot write about for your city papers. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a hint in this sloppy, poorly prepared, hastily prepared overview of how we might think about Seoul in Lefebvre's framework. In this presentation, I'm going to suggest that it is more or less in line with his framework. I'm not going to actively address colonization of Korea, which may be a way that you might choose to break up Lefebvre's argument or not. But I just want to highlight a few of those things. So this is just a rough sense of the kind of situation and discussions I would like to see in your papers. So Seoul, as we know, was founded quite some time ago. I'm not remembering the exact year, 1400s, I think, as a political city, as the center of Koryo Kingdom. Anyway, the kingdom of the Peninsular Kingdom, and we can see the classic map of the capital city is all oriented around the palaces, the various palaces, which function as the physical focal points of the city, with the street leading straight to this palace. And that basically that is what the city is. It is a political city, a center for political decision making around the country. Even though it did, of course, have some commercial activity around here, artisans and whatnot that would serve the needs of the nobles and other residents of the city, which grew over time, of course. This is a picture of that city. We've seen these before, just prior to its further development. But as that mercantile role grows, we can see under the Taehan Empire, we see the introduction of modern conveniences that are designed to better serve commercial interests and to begin to modernize Korea and integrate it a little bit better with the global economy and make it more economically productive. And we can see that with the introduction of the tram lines. We still see that Gyeongbokgung is still here, Gyeongbok Palace. So the political city remains in this within Seoul during this time, but its role as a commercial center begins to increase dramatically. And of course this again shows the growing role of commerce in some of these commercial buildings in the back, and the more increasing importance of transportation in and out of the city. As we discussed, the walls around the gates had to be removed to facilitate the trolley cars, which you can see over here, and other motorized transport. And so we begin to get a little bit more modernization. But with the return, the colonization of Korea by the Japanese, I would suggest that this mercantile role increases, right? As we know, the Japanese in part wanted to open up markets in Korea and in Seoul to access business opportunities and to withdraw natural resources, in particular rice, from the peninsula. And so the rising powers of the Japanese reshape the city and strengthens its role as a hub for importing goods for sale and exporting produce and other products back to Japan. So its commercial role begins to increase, and the importance of the role of merchants continues to increase. Eventually, eventually the Japanese themselves begin to introduce increased industrial production around the perimeter of the city and in other parts of the city as they begin to extend the territory. So we get a rise of an industrial class, which are, of course, all of these facilities are pretty much destroyed during the Korean War, but with the after the Korean War, we see the rapid revitalization of industrial production and the increase in the power of those industrial powers, the Jaebol and what have you. And we can see here, this is a map of land use in Seoul in 1977. This during the period, well into the period of, in fact, almost the end of the period of Park Chung-hee's time in power. But we see here the product of the industrialization of Korea. The purple districts here represent industrial production, and this is a standard land use style map, which I encourage you to use in your papers because they very effectively describe changes in land use, right? These earlier maps will show us the presence of ports and the importance of railroads in reshaping the city, but the land use maps show us how, in somewhat more detail, how those spaces are used. So you see this, in 1977, we see this large presence of industrial production in the center of the city. The red represents the commercial uses, the yellow represents residential uses, and the green represents forestry, right? So what I want you to pay attention to as I switch this slide is the growth of the commercial center here, but more importantly, the loss of industrial space here and the shift here. You're going to see this spot go, you're going to see most of this go, and this is going to transform a little bit too. Because in 1977, they're beginning to enter, perhaps I would suggest, this implosion-explosion phase, right? In 1977, the population of Seoul is increased incredibly. We discussed early on in the semester that population was doubling every 10 years at this time. That's how many people were coming in. And so there's a huge amount of pressure on spaces inside the city and an increasing demand for commercial use as opposed to, and office use, post-industrial economic use, and a push to move industry out of the city into other areas. So watch as the industrial area vanishes. hope. I think maybe my battery's not working so well. There we go. You can see a whole chunk of this industrial area has gone. Some of it has been added over here, Guro, I think. This area has been cut down to allow for the expansion of Gangnam. And we can see an increase in commercial space, Yoido in particular, and here in Gangnam as well. So we see that the plan in 77 is to cause this shift. So as in this industrial city setup, the industrialists have gotten wealthy. They have been in the center of the city, but as they've gotten wealthier, we see the rise of new interests, perhaps urban society interests, that lead to the implosion-explosion. But I'm getting ahead of myself in my sloppily prepared presentation here. Here is another example of this industrial city presence in Seoul. This is a highway, two-tier highway in the middle of the historic center, right? This is where Cheonggyecheon is now. I'm forgetting the name of that highway, Independence Highway or something like this. So there's a two-tiered highway where the river runs underneath this, right? So this industrial city is very strongly focused on industrial production and the needs of moving people and goods throughout the city. But that huge compression of population you see here causes social problems. It causes incredible amounts of crowding. And it begins to create a need for new city center uses. It creates the implosion-explosion of the city. Part of this is the decision in the 1980s, to the late 1980s in particular, to build a number of new towns around Seoul in order to move the population outside of the city, to ease the pressure, the population pressure within the city, and particularly on housing markets, by building brand new suburban new towns around the area. So this very clearly is an explosion of Seoul into the surrounding environs, producing this kind of new urban fabric, right? And eventually, we might argue that in more current times, that we've entered a phase of the urban society in Korea. This is Cheonggyecheon now. This is where that two-tier highway used to run. Now it is become a place of cultural consumption, a tourist destination, a way of creating non-industrial, right? These are spatial urban amenities that serve or shape the commercial activities that are on either side of Cheonggyecheon, right? To revitalize downtown commerce and office building. Here's another example of this kind of consumer society. This is Myeongdong in the 2000s. People crowding. You're not going to see this in coronavirus, right? But certainly this is the way Myeongdong looked for a long time. Urban practices shift to this heavy reliance on consumption for consumption's sake, something that we're beginning to question again under COVID-19. And here again is another example of the kind of urban society construction, right? Here is a mural in Ihwadong near Haewa, which is just awesome, right up these stairs. And it created a kind of, again, like Cheonggye-chan, it creates this spatial intervention, this kind of urbanness, the lifestyle of visiting places like this, seeing these curiosities, and spending money at cafes and bars in the neighborhood is arguably a center of the new sort of urban society that Seoul has embodied. Sadly, this spot became so popular for photographs and everything that the neighbors got incredibly upset, and somebody dumped a huge amount of gray paint over this. I don't know if they've repaired it since, but people just got so annoyed they began to fight back, right? So in a sense, you've got the neighborhood making a spatial intervention in order to reshape people's social practices, right? So again, this is a way in which the urban spatial environment begins to push back against social practice. So in this short video, what I tried to show you is I've tried to outline Seoul's progress from a political city in the early 1500s, its emergence as a mercantile city, particularly just prior to and particularly underneath Japanese control during the occupation, and then its transition into an industrial city in the 1960s and 70s under Park Chung-hee, which moved all of the industrial uses to the center of the city. And then as the industrial uses itself created so much growth inside Seoul that you got this compression, the implosion that made the city explode, leading to the construction of new towns outside and the introduction of new kinds of urban practice that now shape and define what the city is. So the city now in this urban society phase serves as a focal point of culture in Korea. It still embodies the political city, although that's been weakened with the movement of political functions out to Sejong City. It still is a major center of trade and mercantile trade, but it also still has remnants of industrial production. Just on the other side of the hill from this mural are still a number of small textile factories that turn out goods overnight for resale and sale in Dongdaemun. But that now this city itself is dominated by the very fact that Seoul is the place to be. Seoul is the city to be in. It is the center of power, and that power now is partly tied to its physical environment and the construction of housing, the construction of real estate, and the value of that real estate, as well as its cultural production and its role as a center of financial management, of the financial industry in Korea. So something along these lines of showing these changes is the kind of thing that I would like to see you do in your papers. So I hope this helps, And now that I'm finished, I will take these home and upload them. So enjoy. I look forward to reading your papers.